The flame did not dance. It watched. In the biting cold of an Arkansas Ozark cabin, deep in the winter of 1881, a lone trapper named Josiah Kane stared into the unwavering light of his new candle. He had purchased it that afternoon from the widow on the edge of town, the one they called Hemlock. Everyone knew her candles were the best. They burned brighter and lasted 3 times longer than any rancid tallow dip or expensive beeswax taper one could find. In a world where the encroaching darkness was a physical enemy, a good candle was worth more than its weight in silver. But this one was different. There was a strange quality to the light it cast, a greasy, yellow pallor that seemed to suck the warmth from the room rather than provide it. And the smell. It was not the familiar, comforting scent of rendered animal fat. It was cloying, sickly sweet, with a fatty, acrid undertone that clung to the back of his throat. Josiah, a man who had smelled every form of decay the wilderness had to offer, found it profoundly unsettling. He had been told the widow used a forbidden, secret recipe, a process she brought with her from the old country. But as the wax melted, pooling in a translucent disk around the wick, he saw something that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. For a fleeting, impossible moment, a face seemed to swirl within the liquid glow. A human face, contorted in a silent scream. It was the face of a traveling peddler who had passed through Hollow Creek a month prior, a man who had vanished without a trace. Josiah recoiled, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a trick of the light, a figment of a lonely mind. It had to be. But the candle burned on, steady and watchful, its macabre secret glowing in the heart of the unforgiving night. The town of Hollow Creek, Arkansas, was a place carved out of stubborn rock and shadowed valleys. In 1881, it was still nursing the wounds of a brutal war that had ended 16 years prior but felt like yesterday. It was a community of survivors, deeply suspicious of outsiders and steeped in the old ways of folklore and superstition. Here, the line between a hard life and a horrifying one was perilously thin. Every shadow could hide a predator, every unexplained illness could be a curse, and every disappearance was a cautionary tale whispered around weak fires. The wilderness that surrounded them was both their provider and their jailer. It offered up game and timber, but it also swallowed people whole, leaving behind nothing but questions and a gnawing dread. Law was a distant concept, enforced by a single, aging sheriff who was more concerned with keeping the peace within the town's borders than policing the vast, untamed forests that pressed in on all sides. It was into this isolated, anxious world that the widow Elspeth Hemlock had arrived. She appeared 3 years earlier, a refugee from some unnamed tragedy back east that had claimed her husband. She bought the old, dilapidated cabin on the crooked path leading out of town, a place locals already considered tainted, and she kept to herself. Her presence was an unnerving constant. She spoke with a strange, clipped accent, her eyes were a flat, emotionless gray, and she moved with a quiet purpose that seemed to mask something cold and calculating. The townsfolk kept their distance, trading rumors about her like currency. Some said she was a witch, capable of souring milk or calling down fevers. Others claimed she was simply a woman broken by grief. But everyone agreed on one thing: her candles were unnaturally good. And in a place like Hollow Creek, necessity often outweighed fear. Elspeth Hemlock's business began as a quiet, desperate enterprise. Soon after her arrival, with her meager savings dwindling, she began selling her wares from a small, weathered table outside her cabin. At first, it was just soaps, hard lye bars that could strip grease from a skillet or a sole, and herbal salves that promised to cure everything from boils to bad omens. The townspeople were skeptical, but the quality was undeniable. Her soaps cleaned better, and her salves, despite their strange, greasy texture and faint, musky scent, seemed to work. But it was the candles that made her indispensable. In an era lit by sputtering, smoking tallow, Elspeth's creations were a revelation. They were dense, pearlescent white and felt cool and slightly waxy to the touch, almost like human skin. When lit, they produced no smoke, no sputter, only a clean, unwavering flame that burned for hours on end. When Sheriff Boone first bought one for his office, he lit it at dusk and found it still burning, barely diminished the following morning. The news spread through Hollow Creek like wildfire. Soon, a steady stream of townsfolk made the uneasy journey to the widow's cabin. They would hand over their coins, take the offered candle with a hesitant touch, and leave without ever meeting her gaze. Elspeth rarely spoke, simply nodding and taking the money with slender, pale fingers. They ignored the oddities. The fact that she never purchased tallow from the town butcher, the strange, greasy smoke that sometimes billowed from her chimney at odd hours of the night, and the complete absence of any animal pens or slaughtering tools on her property. Where, they might have wondered in a fleeting moment of clarity, did she procure the sheer volume of fat required for such an operation? But the question was always pushed aside, buried beneath the immediate, pressing need for light against the suffocating darkness of the Ozark night. The disappearances had been happening for years, long before the widow arrived. Hollow Creek was a natural thoroughfare for those heading west, a brief stop for drifters, prospectors, and peddlers seeking a night's rest or a few traded goods. Many of these individuals were ghosts even before they arrived, men with no family, no history, and no one to note their absence. When a traveler who had stayed at the local boarding house failed to show up in the next town down the line, it was hardly a cause for alarm. The wilderness was vast and unforgiving. A man could fall into a ravine, be taken by a panther, or simply choose to carve a new path through the dense woods. Sheriff Boone, a man named Jedediah, had a simple philosophy. If no one in town was missing, it wasn't a town problem. He recorded the names in his ledger when he could, but the entries were perfunctory, a litany of the lost. John Smith, peddler, last seen May 1879. An unnamed prospector, last seen October 1880. The list grew, but it remained a collection of disconnected events, not a pattern. No one thought to connect the quiet, unassuming candlemaker on the edge of town to the silent exodus of strangers. Her arrival had not marked the beginning of the vanishing, but in the dark, superstitious minds of some, her presence seemed to coincide with an unsettling acceleration. The intervals between the disappearances grew shorter. A man who stopped in the saloon for a drink in the evening would be gone by morning, his horse still tied to the rail. A surveyor mapping timber claims was last seen heading in the direction of Hemlock's property, his abandoned equipment found a week later, half swallowed by the forest floor. These were still outsiders, men with no roots in Hollow Creek soil, and so their absence remained a quiet, unsettling hum beneath the surface of daily life, a problem no one was yet willing to name. Josiah Kane, the trapper, could not shake the image of the face in the candle. For 2 days he left it unlit, the waxy column sitting on his rough-hewn table like a tombstone. But the memory of that fleeting, horrifying vision was burned into his mind. He was a man of logic, a student of the natural world. He understood light and shadow, the tricks an exhausted mind could play. Yet he also knew the face he had seen. It belonged to a man named Marcus Thorne, a fast-talking peddler of cheap tinware who had a distinctive, jagged scar above his left eye. Josiah had shared a drink with him at the saloon a month back. Thorne had boasted of a good day's sales and mentioned he was heading east at dawn. He was never seen again. Now, Josiah found himself replaying that night, searching for details he had overlooked. He remembered Thorne asking about the best route out of the valley, and someone had mentioned the old path that led right past the widow's cabin. It was a shortcut, they'd said, if you weren't afraid of the stories. Driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress, Josiah decided to visit the widow again. He didn't go to accuse, but to observe. He needed to see her up close, to look for any sign that the horrifying thought taking root in his mind was anything more than madness. He arrived at her property in the late afternoon. The air was still and heavy with the smell of wood smoke, and something else, that same sickly sweet scent from his candle, only stronger, more visceral. He saw her through the trees, a gaunt figure in a dark dress, tending to a large black cast-iron pot over an open fire in her yard. She was stirring the bubbling, milky white contents with a long wooden paddle, her movements methodical and serene. It was a scene of simple domesticity that should have been reassuring, but to Josiah, it was the most macabre thing he had ever witnessed. As Josiah watched from the tree line, a cold dread snaked its way up his spine. The pot Elspeth Hemlock stirred was massive, far larger than what would be needed for cooking a meal or rendering lard from a single pig. It was a boiling cauldron, fit for an industrial process, and the sheer volume of its bubbling contents was staggering. The white, frothy substance churned as she moved the paddle, releasing puffs of greasy steam that carried the nauseatingly sweet odor toward him. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps she was making soap on a grand scale, but she had no livestock, no visible source for such a quantity of fat. He scanned the property, his trapper's eyes missing nothing. The cabin was small and tidy, her yard meticulously swept. But it was the shed behind the house that drew his attention. It was made of dark, weathered wood and had no windows. A thick black stovepipe jutted from its roof, and a wisp of that same strange smoke curled from it, even though the main fire was outside. It seemed fortified, with a heavy, cross-beamed door and a large iron padlock. What secrets required such security? What part of the candle-making process was so forbidden it had to be conducted in a windowless, locked building? His gaze shifted back to the widow. She paused in her stirring, her head cocked as if listening to a sound he couldn't hear. For a terrifying moment he thought she had sensed him. Her head slowly turned, her flat gray eyes scanning the very woods where he stood hidden. He held his breath, his body rigid. Her eyes seemed to pass right over him, empty and void of recognition. Then she returned to her work, her movements once again calm and rhythmic. Josiah backed away slowly, the image of the cauldron and the locked shed seared into his memory. He knew then, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the whispers about the widow were not just superstition. Something deeply wrong, something truly horrifying, was happening on this isolated plot of land. Dr. Alastair Finch was a man of science in a town that ran on faith and fear. He had come to Hollow Creek from Boston, seeking a quieter life and a chance to study the unique herbal remedies of the Ozark people. He was a rationalist, a skeptic who dismissed local legends as the fanciful coping mechanisms of a hard-pressed populace. He found the stories about the widow Hemlock particularly tiresome. To him, she was merely an eccentric recluse, a convenient scapegoat for the town's anxieties. He had even purchased her soaps and was grudgingly impressed by their quality. His scientific mind, however, was piqued by the persistent rumors about her healing salves. He acquired a small tin of the greasy, beige substance to analyze its properties. He found it to be a simple unguent, composed primarily of some form of purified animal fat, or tallow. The exact type was difficult to determine with his limited equipment, but it appeared to be of a very high grade, exceptionally pure and free of the usual impurities. Then, a patient changed everything. A young farmer named Samuel came to his clinic with a peculiar and alarming ailment. He had used one of the widow's salves on a minor cut, and instead of healing, the wound had become inflamed, the surrounding skin puffy and discolored. The infection was unlike any Dr. Finch had ever seen. It was strangely resistant to carbolic acid, and when he lanced the wound, the fluid that emerged was oily and had a faint but distinctly foul odor. It was the smell of rot, but a type of organic decay he couldn't place. He asked Samuel where he got the salve, and the answer, of course, was widow Hemlock. The doctor began to wonder. What kind of fat was she using that could cause such a bizarre and virulent reaction in human tissue? It was a question that science, not superstition, demanded he answer. Josiah Kane couldn't keep his discovery to himself. The image of the cauldron and the disturbing knowledge of what it might contain gnawed at him. He needed to tell someone, but he knew most of the townsfolk would dismiss him as a madman spooked by shadows. He needed someone who would listen, someone who dealt in facts, not folklore. His mind turned to Sheriff Boone. The sheriff was a practical, if weary, man. He found Boone sitting in his small, dusty office, cleaning his service revolver with a slow, methodical rhythm. Josiah stumbled through his story, his voice low and urgent. He described the candle, the face he saw in the wax, the peddler Marcus Thorne, and the macabre scene he had witnessed at the widow's property. The massive pot, the windowless shed, the cloying smell. The sheriff listened patiently, his face unreadable. When Josiah finished, Boone set down his revolver and sighed, a sound heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much trouble in his life. "Josiah," he said, his voice raspy, "a face and a candle, a big pot of soap. You've been alone in those woods too long." He reminded Josiah that travelers vanished all the time and that Elspeth Hemlock was just a strange old woman trying to make a living. He had no evidence, only a wild, horrifying story. A warrant required proof, not shadows and bad feelings. "Unless you can bring me something solid," Boone concluded, "a belonging of one of these missing men found on her land, a witness who saw her do something criminal, my hands are tied. It's just a creepy story." Josiah left the sheriff's office feeling frustrated and foolish, but more determined than ever. If the law wouldn't act on suspicion, then he would have to find the proof himself. His focus now narrowed to a single, grim objective. He had to get inside that locked shed. The sheriff's dismissal did not deter Josiah, it galvanized him. He began a quiet, obsessive investigation of his own. He was a hunter by trade, and he now applied those skills to a new kind of prey. He started by speaking to others in town, not with wild accusations, but with subtle, probing questions. He talked to the blacksmith about a missing journeyman who had come seeking work. He spoke to the saloon owner about a well-dressed gambler from out of state who had won big one night and was gone the next. He compiled a list of names, dates, and descriptions, cross-referencing them with the sheriff's own neglected ledger of the vanished. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. Each missing person was a transient, someone with no local connections. Each had a bit of money or valuable goods. And each, in the days before they disappeared, had been mentioned in passing as having business on the east side of town, in the direction of the old crooked path. Josiah started spending his days in the woods surrounding Elspeth Hemlock's property, moving like a ghost through the underbrush. He learned her routines. He noted when she gathered wood, when she tended her small garden, and when she fired up the great cauldron. He saw other townsfolk come and go, their transactions always brief and silent. He mapped out the trails and animal paths, searching for anything out of place. One afternoon, his patience was rewarded. Near a small creek that ran behind her property, half buried in the mud and leaves, he saw the glint of metal. He dug it out with his bare hands. It was a silver pocket watch, its casing tarnished but intact. He pried it open. The watch was broken, its hands frozen at 2:15. But inside the cover, a faint, elegant inscription was still visible. "To my dearest Charles, upon his graduation. Your loving father, 1878. Josiah recognized the name. Charles Abernathy was a surveyor from St. Louis, reported missing almost 6 months ago. Clutching the pocket watch, Josiah felt a surge of grim vindication. This was the proof Sheriff Boone had demanded. This was something tangible, a direct link between a vanished man and the widow's cursed land. He resisted the urge to storm back to the sheriff's office immediately. He needed to be smarter. Boone could still dismiss it as a coincidence, an item dropped and washed downstream. Josiah needed more. His attention returned to the locked shed, which now loomed in his mind as the dark heart of the entire mystery. He had to know what was inside. He spent the next 2 nights observing the cabin, waiting for an opportunity. It came during a fierce thunderstorm that rolled down from the mountains, shaking the valley with concussive blasts of thunder and blinding flashes of lightning. The storm provided the perfect cover, its noise masking any sounds he might make. Dressed in dark clothing with his face smeared with mud, he crept toward the property under the deluge. The cabin was dark. The widow had presumably retired for the night. The shed stood as a black silhouette against the violent, strobing sky. He reached the heavy door and examined the padlock. It was old and rusted but thick. He had brought a pry bar with him, a tool he used for his traps. He wedged the tip into the hasp, his muscles straining against the unyielding metal. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp, and thunder cracked directly overhead, making him jump. He put his full weight into it, gritting his teeth. With a loud, groaning screech that was mercifully swallowed by the storm, the rusted metal tore free from the wooden frame. The door swung inward with a low moan, opening into a pit of absolute darkness. A horrifying stench, far more potent than the smell of the candles, rolled out to meet him, the smell of a slaughterhouse mixed with chemicals and something else, something uniquely and disturbingly human. Josiah stood at the threshold of the forbidden shed, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the roar of the storm. He fumbled in his pouch for a match and a small candle stub, one of his own made of simple beef tallow. Striking the match with a trembling hand, he cupped the tiny flame and touched it to the wick. The warm, familiar light pushed back the suffocating darkness, and what it revealed made him gag, stumbling back a step. The shed was a workshop of macabre industry. Along one wall hung an array of tools, not for woodworking or farming but for butchery. There were cleavers, bone saws, and long, wicked-looking flensing knives, all meticulously cleaned and sharpened, gleaming in the candlelight. In the center of the room stood a massive, slate-topped table, its surface stained with dark, geography-like patterns. Deep grooves were carved into its perimeter, all leading to a single drainage hole that emptied into a bucket below. But it was the far corner that held the true horror. There stood several large wooden barrels sealed with lids. One of them was slightly ajar. Steeling himself, Josiah approached and lifted the heavy lid. The smell that erupted was overwhelming, a concentrated version of the sweet, rotten odor that permeated the property. Inside, floating in a thick, briny liquid, were items. He saw what looked like clothing, boots, and leather belts, all stripped from their owners. He reached in with his pry bar and hooked a piece of cloth, pulling it out. It was a wool coat, the kind worn by the missing peddler Marcus Thorne. Plunging the bar deeper, he felt it strike something hard. He fished it out. It was a human skull, picked clean and bleached white, its empty sockets staring up at him in silent accusation. A wave of nausea and terror washed over him. He dropped the lid back onto the barrel with a deafening crash and scrambled out of the shed, back into the cleansing rain, the horrifying truth burning brighter and more terrible than any candle flame. The whispers in Hollow Creek were about to become a scream. The small, isolated community stood on the precipice of a revelation so dark it would forever stain its history. Josiah now held irrefutable proof, not just of one crime, but of a systematic, horrifying operation. The pocket watch, the tools, the barrels filled with the personal effects of the dead. It was a cold case breaking wide open, and the evidence pointed to a monster hiding in plain sight. This is the kind of forbidden history that gets buried, the kind of macabre tale that time tries to forget. If you find these stories as fascinating as we do, and believe they deserve to be unearthed, make sure you're subscribed. The truth is often more disturbing than fiction, and what lay at the bottom of those barrels was just the beginning. The real horror was not just what the widow did with the bodies, but what she did with the rest of them. The true nature of her secret ingredient was about to be exposed, and it would plunge the town of Hollow Creek into a nightmare from which it would never fully awaken. What Josiah had discovered was the gruesome preamble to an even more disturbing truth, one hidden in the very products the townsfolk had been bringing into their homes, lighting on their mantles, and using to wash their children's faces. The secrets of the widow's craft were about to come to light, and the town would soon learn the horrifying cost of the brightest candles in the Ozarks. Dr. Finch's investigation was proceeding along a parallel, more scientific track. The strange infection suffered by the young farmer, Samuel, continued to confound him. Standard treatments were failing, and the tissue around the wound was beginning to show signs of necrosis, but of a peculiar, saponaceous kind. It was as if the flesh itself was undergoing a chemical change, becoming waxy and inert. Frustrated, the doctor decided to conduct a more thorough analysis of the widow's salve. He took a sample and began a process of rendering it down, separating its core components using heat and alcohol. As the fatty substance heated in his small laboratory, it released that same, faintly sweet and musky odor he had noted before. He continued the process, slowly distilling the substance until he had isolated the purest form of the fat. He placed a small amount of this refined material under his microscope. What he saw puzzled him. The cellular structure of the fat was not what he expected. It wasn't beef tallow or pork lard. The lipid globules were smaller, more densely packed, arranged in a pattern he had only ever seen in anatomical textbooks. He cross-referenced his medical journals, his hands shaking slightly as a horrifying hypothesis began to form in his mind. The structure was undeniably, terrifyingly familiar. It was consistent with only one type of mammal. He performed one final, simple test. He took a small amount of the purified fat and placed it on a slide next to a sample of adipose tissue he had preserved from a human cadaver during his medical training. Under the microscope, the two were identical. The cellular structure, the size of the globules, the way the light passed through them, it was a perfect match. Dr. Finch pushed back from his desk, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The widow's salves, the miracle cures the townspeople had been rubbing into their skin, were made from rendered human fat. At the same moment Dr. Finch was making his clinical, horrifying discovery, Josiah Kane was stumbling through the pre-dawn darkness toward the sheriff's office, the pocket watch in one hand and the ghastly image of the skull burned into his mind. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cold. He found Sheriff Boone sleeping on a cot in his office. Josiah slammed the watch down on the desk, the sharp crack echoing in the silent room. "Abernathy's watch," Josiah rasped, his voice raw. "I found it on her land, and there's more, much more." He recounted his illicit journey into the widow's shed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. He described the butcher's tools, the stained table, and the horrifying barrels filled with the belongings of the dead. He told him about the skull. This time the sheriff did not sigh. He picked up the watch, his eyes narrowed, the last vestiges of sleep vanishing from his face. The weariness was replaced by a grim hardness. The watch was concrete. The story of the shed, while sounding like a madman's raving, now had the chilling ring of truth. Boone knew Charles Abernathy's name. He had personally filed the missing person report at the request of the man's family in St. Louis. He stood up, strapped on his gun belt, and looked at Josiah. "Get Dr. Finch," he said, his voice low and steady. "Tell him to meet me here, and don't say a word of this to anyone else. If what you're saying is true, we're not just dealing with a thief. We're dealing with something else entirely." The sheriff's mind raced. How could one woman do all this? How could such a macabre enterprise operate so close to his town without anyone knowing? The questions were horrifying, but the answers, he suspected, were waiting in that dark, windowless shed. When Dr. Finch arrived at the sheriff's office, his face was pale and taut with a clinical horror that mirrored Josiah's raw terror. Before Boone could even speak, the doctor placed a small, corked vial on the desk. Inside was a sample of the purified, yellowish fat. "Sheriff," Dr. Finch began, his voice barely a whisper, "I have reason to believe that the salves Elspeth Hemlock has been selling throughout this town are made from adipocere. It's a waxy substance formed from the saponification of human body fat." He explained his findings, the microscopic analysis, the identical cellular structures. The two stories, Josiah's and the doctor's, converged in the small, dusty office to form a single, monstrous narrative. It was a tale of murder, dismemberment, and a form of cannibalism so grotesque and detached it defied all comprehension. The missing travelers were not just being robbed and killed. Their bodies were being harvested. They were the raw material for a horrifying cottage industry. Sheriff Boone stared at the vial, then at the two men before him. The full scope of the evil he was facing began to settle upon him like a physical weight. The candles. He thought of the long-burning, smokeless candles sitting on the desks and mantels of nearly every home in Hollow Creek, including his own. If the salves were made of human fat, what in God's name was in the candles? The answer was immediate and sickening. It was the same source. The entire town had been living by the light of rendered human remains. They had unknowingly welcomed this macabre product into the very heart of their homes, lighting their evening meals and reading their children bedtime stories by its ghoulish glow. The sheriff felt a profound sense of violation, a deep, personal shame. The darkness he was meant to hold at bay had been invited inside, disguised as a beautiful, unwavering light. Sheriff Boone knew he couldn't act alone. A raid on the widow's cabin was necessary, but it had to be handled carefully. He didn't want to spark a panic or a mob. He deputized Josiah on the spot and instructed him and Dr. Finch to gather a small, trusted posse of the town's most level-headed men. They were to be told only that they were serving a warrant on suspicion of robbery, nothing more. The horrifying truth was too volatile to be released just yet. As the men gathered in the gray light of dawn, an unsettling quiet fell over them. They knew the sheriff was a man who did not act rashly, and the grim set of his jaw told them this was no ordinary matter. Armed with rifles and resolve, the small group made their way toward the crooked path at the edge of town. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. But as they neared Elspeth Hemlock's property, that other smell began to assert itself, the faint, sickly sweet odor of her work, now imbued with a terrifying new significance. They moved with the caution of soldiers entering enemy territory. The cabin appeared quiet, almost serene. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney, indicating the widow was awake. There were no sounds, no signs of alarm. She was completely unaware of the net that was closing around her. Sheriff Boone posted 2 men to watch the back of the cabin, then walked with Josiah and Dr. Finch to the front door. He held the warrant in a hand that was surprisingly steady. All his years as a lawman, all the skirmishes and standoffs he had endured, felt like a prelude to this single, surreal moment. He was about to knock on the door of a woman who made candles from the dead. He raised his fist, the wood of the door cool beneath his knuckles, and knocked 3 times. The sound was unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The door opened almost immediately. Elspeth Hemlock stood there, framed in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. She was smaller than they remembered, her features plain and unremarkable. There were no outward signs of monstrosity. She did not look like a witch from a dark fairy tale. She looked like any other impoverished widow trying to survive on the frontier. Her gray eyes betrayed no surprise, no fear. She simply looked at the sheriff, then at the armed men behind him with a kind of weary resignation, as if she had been expecting this visit for a very long time. "Sheriff Boone," she said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, "to what do I owe the pleasure of this early morning call?" Boone held up the warrant. "Mrs. Hemlock, I have a warrant to search your property in connection with the disappearance of Charles Abernathy." He watched her face for any reaction, any flicker of guilt or panic. There was none. She merely nodded, her expression unchanging. "As you wish," she said, and stepped aside, holding the door open for them. Her calmness was more unnerving than any protest or denial would have been. It was the placid demeanor of someone who had no more secrets to hide, or perhaps someone who believed her actions were beyond the judgment of ordinary men. Dr. Finch and Josiah exchanged a disbelieving look. As Boone and his men stepped across the threshold, they were met with a scene of impeccable, almost sterile cleanliness. The cabin's single room was sparse but tidy. The floor was swept clean, the bed was neatly made, and there was no hint of the gruesome work that fueled her small enterprise. It was a calculated, chilling performance of normalcy, a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal an unimaginable horror. While Sheriff Boone and Dr. Finch began their search of the cabin, Josiah led 2 other men directly to the shed. The broken hasp hung from the doorframe, a clear sign of his earlier intrusion, yet the widow had shown no reaction to it. It was as if she considered the contents of the shed to be a matter of public record now, the game already over. They swung the heavy door open, this time unleashing the stench into the bright morning air. In the daylight, the interior was even more horrifying. The details Josiah had missed in the flickering candlelight now stood out in stark relief. The dark stains on the slate table were clearly blood, soaked deep into the porous stone. The flensing knives on the wall bore microscopic traces of flesh and fat. One of the deputies, a young man named Miller, turned pale and retched into the bushes. The other, a hardened farmer, simply stared, his face a mask of disbelief. Josiah went straight to the barrels. With the help of the other deputy, he pried the lids off each one. They were all the same. The first was filled with clothing and personal effects, a waterlogged testament to the identities of the vanished. In the second, they found more bones, jumbled together like discarded firewood. but it was the third and fourth barrels that contained the most crucial evidence of her process. They were filled with scraps, the parts of the human body from which she could not easily render fat or tissue, hands, feet, and viscera, all preserved in the same foul-smelling brine. It was a human scrap pile, the grisly refuse of her craft. The scene was one of efficient, pragmatic butchery. There was no sign of ritual or madness, only the cold, methodical processing of a resource. This detachment was, perhaps, the most disturbing discovery of all. The victims had been reduced to their component parts, their humanity stripped away until all that remained was raw material. Back in the cabin, the search was initially fruitless. The space was so clean it felt unnatural. Dr. Finch, however, noticed something odd about the large stone fireplace. While the rest of the cabin was old and weathered, the mortar around some of the hearthstones looked newer, a slightly different color. He pointed it out to the sheriff. Using a crowbar from the woodpile, they pried at the stones. They came loose with a grating sound, revealing a hidden cavity behind them. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several leather-bound ledgers. The sheriff pulled them out. He opened the first one. The page was filled with neat, precise handwriting. It was not a diary, but a meticulous accounting log. Each entry began with a date, followed by a brief description of an individual: male approx. 40, stout-build peddler; male 25, slender surveyor; female approx. 30, fair hair traveler. Beside each description was a series of chillingly practical notations. One column was labeled weight est, another fat yield pounds, and a third products. Underneath this last column were entries like 20 pounds, fine soap, 12 dozen premier candles, and 3 tins medicinal salve. It was the business ledger of a serial killer. She had documented her victims with the dispassionate detail of a farmer recording his livestock. Flipping through the pages, Boone saw dozens of entries, a secret history of the region's missing persons stretching back years. The final entry was dated just a week prior, corresponding to a young man who had been heading to a lumber camp up north. According to the widow's log, his remains had yielded 8 dozen exceptional candles. The sheriff felt his stomach clench. He had bought one of those very candles himself just 2 days ago. It was still sitting on his desk. The full, horrifying truth was now laid bare, documented in the killer's own hand. Sheriff Boone walked out of the cabin, the ledger held tight in his hand, his face like granite. He found Elspeth Hemlock standing by the now-open shed, looking at the chaos of her exposed workshop with that same unnerving calm. She turned her flat gray eyes to him as he approached. There was no point in questioning, no need for a confession. The evidence was absolute and overwhelming. "Elspeth Hemlock," Boone said, his voice cold and official, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Charles Abernathy, Marcus Thorne, and all the others." He gestured with the ledger. "It's all in here." She looked at the book and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "A woman must make a living, Sheriff," she said, her voice even. "Tallow is expensive. The roads provide." This simple, pragmatic statement was more chilling than any maniacal rant. In her mind there was no malice, no evil. It was a matter of economics. She saw no difference between rendering fat from a stray hog and rendering it from a lone traveler. Both were resources, available to be harvested by someone with the skill and the lack of sentiment to do so. Her victims were not people to her. They were ingredients. As the deputies bound her hands, she did not resist. She walked with them toward the cart that would take her to the town jail, her posture erect, her expression serene. The townspeople, who had begun to gather at the edge of the property, drawn by the commotion, stared in stunned silence. They saw the deputies carrying items from the shed, they saw the grim faces of the posse, and they saw the calm, unassuming widow being led away in chains. They could not yet comprehend the nature of her crime, but a collective sense of dread began to wash over them, a premonition that the world was far darker than they had ever dared to imagine. News of the widow's arrest and the reason for it spread through Hollow Creek not like a wildfire, but like a plague. It was a creeping, sickening realization that passed from person to person in hushed, horrified whispers. The initial disbelief quickly gave way to a wave of collective revulsion and self-incrimination. The truth was too monstrous to easily accept. The candles that lit their homes, the soaps that cleaned their bodies, the salves that soothed their ailments, all were products of the grave, crafted from the stolen bodies of the missing. A profound psychological trauma took hold of the town. People began to smash their candles, throwing the waxy, white sticks into the street or burying them in their yards as if they were cursed artifacts. They scrubbed their hands raw, trying to wash away the imagined taint of the soap. Every home that had used her products felt violated, defiled. The light they had cherished now seemed like a beacon of ghoulish mockery. The very air in their homes, once filled with the faint, sweet scent of the burning candles, now felt heavy with the ghosts of the dead. The horror was deeply personal. Mothers thought of the light they had used to check on their sleeping children. Husbands thought of the romantic glow cast over their marital beds. The town preacher, who had praised the long-lasting candles from his pulpit, fell into a stunned, prayerful silence. Hollow Creek had unwittingly become a community of consumers in the most macabre marketplace imaginable. They had been living in a shared delusion, ignoring the subtle warnings, the strange smell, the widow's reclusiveness, the mounting disappearances, because the product was just too good. Their comfort and convenience had been bought at a horrifying, unspeakable price. The arrest of Elspeth Hemlock presented Sheriff Boone with a new and immediate problem: what to do with her. The town jail was little more than a single cell with a flimsy lock, designed to hold a drunk overnight, not a methodical mass murderer. More importantly, the mood in the town was turning ugly. The initial shock was hardening into a cold, vengeful fury. Men gathered in the saloon, their whispers growing louder, their talk turning to vigilante justice. They spoke of a rope and the large oak tree in the center of town. Boone knew that if he kept her in Hollow Creek, she wouldn't survive to see a trial. The people's need for a violent, immediate catharsis was too strong. He had to get her to the county seat in Harrison, where she could be held in a proper federal jail and tried by a circuit judge. He made his decision quickly. Under the cover of darkness, just one day after her arrest, Boone and his most trusted deputy loaded Elspeth Hemlock into a covered wagon. She remained completely silent and compliant, her eerie calm a stark contrast to the simmering rage of the town she was leaving behind. They slipped out of Hollow Creek unnoticed, taking the winding northern road toward Harrison, a 2-day journey through the rugged mountains. The sheriff was not just transporting a prisoner. He was smuggling out the living embodiment of his town's darkest secret. As the wagon rattled away, leaving the flickering lanterns of Hollow Creek behind, Boone felt a profound sense of failure. He had protected the town from external threats, but the greatest monster had been living right among them, and he had been just as blind as everyone else. Now, the town's soul was forever scarred, and he wondered if any trial or execution could ever truly cleanse the stain of the widow's macabre trade. The journey to Harrison was a tense and surreal affair. Sheriff Boone drove the wagon, his deputy sitting in the back with a shotgun leveled at the silent, shackled figure of Elspeth Hemlock. For hours, she did not speak a word. She simply sat, staring out at the passing landscape with her unblinking gray eyes. The sheriff found the silence more unnerving than any confession. He felt a desperate need to understand, to hear some explanation for her monstrous actions that his mind could process. Finally, he could bear it no longer. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough, not turning to look at her. "All those people, why did you do it?" The wagon wheels crunched on the gravel road for a long moment before she answered. Her voice, when it came, was as flat and lifeless as a winter sky. "The world is a hard place, Sheriff," she began. "It takes and it takes. My husband, he was a hard man. He taught me that sentiment is a luxury. He taught me what a body is. It's just meat and bone and fat. When he died, I had nothing. No skills, no family." She paused, and for the first time a flicker of something, not emotion but a cold, hard logic entered her voice. "People are wasteful. They live and die and their bodies are put in the ground to rot, a waste of good material. I saw a resource where others saw only grief. I provided a service. People needed light. I provided it. What I used to make it is simply a matter of process." Her explanation was so devoid of morality, so chillingly pragmatic that it left Boone speechless. She was not insane. She was not driven by bloodlust. She was a creature of pure, unadulterated utility, a predator who saw the world not in terms of good and evil, but in terms of assets and waste. The story of what happened to Elspeth Hemlock after she left Hollow Creek becomes murky, lost to the unreliable records and tall tales of the era. The official account is that Sheriff Boone successfully delivered her to the federal marshal in Harrison. A trial was scheduled, a prosecutor assigned. But this is where the clear, factual narrative begins to fray and dissolve into legend. According to one version of the story, Elspeth Hemlock never stood trial. While awaiting the circuit judge, she managed to escape from the supposedly secure jail. How a small, unassuming woman could vanish from a locked cell remains a mystery. Some said she had help, a secret accomplice no one knew about. Others, falling back on the old superstitions, claimed she used dark arts to simply walk through the walls. Another, more gruesome tale suggests that a mob from Hollow Creek and surrounding towns, unwilling to wait for the slow process of the law, stormed the Harrison jail. They dragged her from her cell and administered their own brutal justice, hanging her from a tree outside the courthouse. Yet, there is no official record of such a lynching, no grave marked with her name. The most disturbing story, however, is that the authorities, fearing the widespread panic and revulsion her public trial would cause, made a secret deal. They spirited her away, perhaps to an asylum in another state, or simply released her on the condition that she disappear forever, her crimes too horrifying to be entered into the public record. They chose to bury the story, to let the monster of Hollow Creek simply vanish. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Elspeth Hemlock disappeared from history, leaving behind only a horrifying legacy and a chilling, unresolved ending. Back in Hollow Creek, the absence of a public trial or a confirmed execution left a festering wound. There was no closure, no final act of justice to purge the town of its trauma. The widow had simply vanished, leaving them alone with their defiled memories. The story of her crimes became a local curse, a forbidden legend told only in hushed tones. The cabin on the crooked path was burned to the ground by vengeful townspeople the night after her removal, but even the fire could not erase the stain. The land itself was considered tainted, and for generations no one would build there. The name Elspeth Hemlock became a local byword for ultimate evil, a cautionary tale used to frighten children into obedience. Be good, or the candle widow will get you. The psychological impact was devastating and long-lasting. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. Who had been her most frequent customer? Who had praised the candles the loudest? A collective guilt settled over the community. They had all been complicit, trading their willful ignorance for the comfort of a brighter light. The event marked a turning point for the town. The post-war optimism, the sense of rugged community, was shattered. It was replaced by a deep-seated paranoia and a grim understanding of the darkness that could lurk behind the most ordinary facade. Hollow Creek became known as a place with a shadow over it, a town that had once lit its homes with the dead. Travelers began to bypass it, and the community slowly withered, its growth stunted by the horrifying memory of the widow who sold candles made of human fat. The light had gone out in Hollow Creek, perhaps for good. The macabre industry of Elspeth Hemlock raises a question that is both scientific and deeply unsettling. Is it even possible? The answer is a horrifying yes. The process involves rendering, the same technique used for centuries to extract tallow from animal fat. Human adipose tissue, or body fat, can be heated in a cauldron until it liquefies. The water boils off, and solid impurities such as connective tissue can be skimmed from the surface. What remains is a purified liquid fat. Once this cools, it solidifies into a waxy substance known as adipose cere, or more commonly, grave wax. This substance is chemically similar to tallow, and when combined with a wick would indeed be combustible. In fact, due to the specific lipid composition of human fat, it could theoretically produce a candle that burns slowly, cleanly, and with a bright, steady flame, exactly as the legends describe. The quantities are also grimly plausible. A healthy adult male weighing 200 pounds could yield anywhere from 40 to 60 pounds of renderable fat. According to the widow's own ledgers, this would be enough to produce dozens of her premier candles and a significant amount of soap and salves. A steady supply of victims, the lone travelers and drifters who populated the roads of post-war America, would allow such a horrifying enterprise to continue indefinitely. The science behind the horror is sound. This was not witchcraft or some supernatural event. It was a cold, calculated application of a known process to a forbidden source material. The horror lies not in its impossibility, but in its stark, methodical feasibility. It required only a complete absence of empathy, a profound disregard for human life, and a deeply pragmatic, resourceful mind. Elspeth Hemlock possessed all three. The tale of the Candle Widow of Arkansas is not an isolated incident in the grim annals of history. While her specific method was uniquely grotesque, the concept of utilizing human remains for practical or profane purposes is a dark thread woven throughout human history. In the 17th and 18th centuries, a medicinal substance called mumia was popular in Europe. It was, shockingly, a powder made from ground-up Egyptian mummies, believed to cure a variety of ailments. Skulls were fashioned into drinking cups by cultures from the Vikings to Tibetan monks. In the aftermath of major battles like Waterloo, the practice of bone grinding was a grim reality. The bones of fallen soldiers were collected, ground into dust, and sold as agricultural fertilizer, a macabre form of recycling that turned battlefields into grim harvests. Even more directly related to Elspeth Hemlock's craft is the historical use of human fat itself. In some parts of pre-modern Europe, the rendered fat of executed criminals was believed by some to have magical or medicinal properties, and was sold by executioners as a grim side business. What sets the Hollow Creek case apart is its industrial scale and its commercial disguise. This was not a ritual or a grim battlefield cleanup. This was a calculated business model, turning murder into a consumer product that was then sold back to an unsuspecting community. It represents a horrifying intersection of pragmatism and monstrosity, a uniquely American Gothic tale of frontier capitalism taken to its most depraved conclusion. The story is horrifying not just because it involves murder, but because it involves the complete commodification of the human body, reducing people to mere pounds of usable fat, a resource to be harvested and sold on the open market. The legacy of Elspeth Hemlock's actions extends far beyond the traumatized town of Hollow Creek. It taps into a primal fear, the fear of a hidden, monstrous truth concealed within the mundane. It's the unsettling idea that the everyday items we use and trust could have a horrifying, forbidden origin. The story is a stark reminder that the smooth, polished surfaces of civilization can often hide a foundation of brutality. The townspeople needed light, a basic necessity for survival and comfort. The widow provided it. This simple economic transaction masked a chain of predation and desecration, so profound it defies belief. The doors to these dark stories are often locked for a reason. They reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature, desperation, and the terrifying logic that can arise when empathy is extinguished. If you dare to see what's inside these locked rooms of history, and believe these forbidden tales must be told, click the notification bell. What was found in the widow's cellar and documented in her ledgers was an account so disturbing that local authorities allegedly tried to have it banned from public record for nearly a century. Hopping the story would simply die. But some horrors refuse to be buried. The story of the Candle Widow serves as a chilling allegory. It forces us to ask, what dark processes are we complicit in through our own willful ignorance? What horrors might underpin the comforts we take for granted? The bright, steady flame of progress and convenience can sometimes be fueled by the most macabre of secrets, and we, like the people of Hollow Creek, might prefer not to ask where the tallow comes from, so long as the light burns brightly. The psychological profile of a killer like Elspeth Hemlock is profoundly disturbing precisely because it deviates from our typical understanding of violent criminals. She did not appear to be driven by rage, passion, or a lust for cruelty. The meticulous state of her tools, the cleanliness of her cabin, and the detailed financial records she kept in her ledgers all point away from a disorganized, chaotic killer. Instead, they suggest a mind that is orderly, patient, and chillingly rational. She would likely be classified today as a psychopath, exhibiting a complete lack of empathy, an absence of remorse, and a grandiose sense of her own logic. To her, the moral and ethical rules of society were arbitrary and irrelevant constraints. She saw a problem, her own poverty, and devised a brutally efficient solution. The human cost was simply a variable she chose to ignore. This type of killer is often referred to as an instrumental predator. The violence is not the goal in itself. It is merely a tool, a means to an end. For Hemlock, the end was financial stability and the production of a superior product. The murders were just the first step in her manufacturing process. This pragmatic approach is what makes her so terrifying. It's easier to comprehend a killer who acts out of a recognizable, if twisted, human emotion like rage or jealousy. It is far harder to understand a mind that views other human beings with the same emotional detachment. A carpenter views a piece of lumber, or a butcher views a side of beef. She was a monster not of passion, but of cold, calculating reason. What became of the men who brought the widow to justice? Their lives, too, were irrevocably altered. Sheriff Boone, once a pillar of weary stability, was said to have retired soon after the incident. The weight of the discovery, the knowledge of the horror that had flourished under his watch, broke his spirit. He had spent his life keeping the peace, only to find that the greatest evil had been hiding in plain sight, a fact his conscience could not reconcile. He reportedly moved away, seeking an anonymity that could never truly erase what he had seen in that windowless shed. Josiah Kane, the trapper whose morbid curiosity first uncovered the truth, became a local hero, but it was a mantle he wore with great discomfort. He was celebrated for his bravery, but he was haunted by the images of the skull in the barrel and the face in the candle. He became more reclusive than ever, retreating deep into the Ozark wilderness, as if trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the tainted world of men. He was a man who had looked directly into the abyss, and it had looked back. Dr. Alastair Finch, the man of science, found his rational worldview shattered. He had come to the Ozarks to study folk remedies and found a horror that defied clinical explanation. The case of the Candle Widow was a brutal lesson that not all monstrosity could be dissected under a microscope or explained away by logic. He remained in Hollow Creek, a more somber and cautious man, forever reminded that even the most enlightened mind is no match for the profound darkness that can reside in the human heart. The objects themselves, the candles, the soaps, the salves, took on a life of their own in the local folklore. Long after they were destroyed, stories about them persisted. It was said that if you found an old, forgotten candle from that era and dared to light it, it wouldn't just give off light. It would whisper the names of the dead. Some claimed that the flame would cast shadows that weren't there, the ghostly figures of the widow's victims reenacting their final, desperate moments. The soaps became the subject of a particularly gruesome legend. Parents would warn their children that if they didn't wash properly, their skin would take on a waxy, pale quality, a sign that the widow's curse was taking hold, slowly turning them into the very substance of her cursed products. These stories were more than just spooky tales. They were a community's attempt to process an unimaginable trauma. By turning the objects into cursed artifacts, they could externalize the horror, placing the evil into the items themselves rather than acknowledging the more difficult truth, that the evil had resided in a person, a neighbor they had known and traded with. It was easier to believe in haunted candles than it was to accept that a woman could systematically butcher her fellow human beings for profit. The folklore served as a necessary veil, a way to contain a horror so immense that looking at it directly was simply too much for the human mind to bear. The legends were the scar tissue that formed over the town's deepest wound. Could a story like this be true? While the specific named case of Elspeth Hemlock, In 1881, Arkansas is a legend, a piece of macabre folklore. Its core elements are rooted in historical plausibility. The American frontier of the late 19th century was a lawless, transient, and often brutal place. Record-keeping was poor, and people, especially those without family or community ties, could and did disappear without a trace. In isolated communities like the fictional Hollow Creek, a lone sheriff would be easily overwhelmed, and the disappearance of outsiders would not have been a top priority. The era was also one of profound hardship and desperation. The post-Civil War period in the South was marked by extreme poverty, and survival often depended on ruthless pragmatism. In this context, the idea of a deeply psychopathic individual resorting to such a horrifying enterprise to make a living is, while extreme, not entirely outside the realm of possibility. The legend likely coalesced from a variety of fears and historical realities: the distrust of outsiders and witches, the real-life dangers of travel, and the grim necessity of frontier life. It is a story that consolidates the ambient fears of an era into a single, terrifying narrative figure. Whether a real woman committed these exact acts is a matter of folklore, but the conditions that would allow such a monster to exist were very, very real. The story of the Candle Widow is a historical, what if, a legend built upon a plausible foundation of darkness. The tale ends where it began, in darkness with a single watching flame. The story of Elspeth Hemlock serves as a permanent, chilling fixture in the landscape of American folklore, a testament to the darkness that can hide in the most unassuming corners of the world. Her cabin is gone. The town of Hollow Creek may now be nothing more than a ghost of its former self, and the records of her existence are lost to time. But the horror of her craft remains. It lingers in the collective subconscious, a macabre cautionary tale about the true cost of convenience and the danger of ignoring the small, unsettling details that hint at a much larger evil. The unresolved nature of her fate only adds to the legend's power. Did she escape, free to continue her trade in another unsuspecting town, under a different name? Was she torn apart by a mob, her own body rendered into nothingness by the very violence she perfected? Or did she simply vanish, a ghost who walked out of the pages of history, leaving us to wonder? The lack of an ending is, perhaps, the most terrifying part of the story. It suggests that this kind of evil is not easily contained or destroyed. It can simply move on, waiting for another desperate time, another isolated place, another community willing to buy a better, brighter light without asking too many questions about its source. The flame of the widow's candle may have been extinguished in Arkansas, but the darkness that created it is eternal. It just waits, patiently, for the right ingredients, and for someone with the cold, pragmatic will to light it once again.